June 6, 1944, Normandy Beach. A Sherman tank, known as Fury, sustains a direct impact. Its occupants evacuate. The operation concludes, save for one man's unwavering resolve to remain. Sergeant Curtis Cullen possessed no formal engineering qualifications, no specialized instruction, only an audacious concept involving salvaged metal and a welding torch. His superior officer deemed him utterly irrational. Yet, the device he fashioned within 48 hours would irreversibly alter the course of the invasion. One disabled tank, one unconventional mechanic, and an innovation so straightforward, so ingenious, that General Eisenhower himself mandated the construction of 5,000 units. This is the account omitted from conventional historical narratives. The chronicle of how a sergeant, armed with a blowtorch, became instrumental in saving D-Day. Remain with us until the conclusion, for the events that transpired afterward astonished all. Normandy, France, June 1944, 6 days subsequent to D-Day, and the Allied progression had come to an absolute standstill. Not due to German tanks nor artillery barrages, but rather owing to the ubiquitous hedgerows. These were not the ornamental shrubbery one might find in a domestic garden. Norman hedgerows were ancient fortifications, substantial embankments of earth, stone, and interwoven roots, meticulously constructed by farmers over generations to delineate property lines. Some reached heights of 15 feet and were equally as formidable in width. Their root systems plunged 10 feet or more into the soil. They functioned as natural strongholds, and they crisscrossed Normandy like an intricate labyrinth. For American tank crews, these hedgerows transformed into lethal traps. Each instance a Sherman tank attempted to surmount a hedgerow, its thinly armored underside became exposed, its most vulnerable aspect. German soldiers positioned on the opposite side, equipped with anti-tank weaponry, would patiently await. The precise moment a Sherman's underbelly became visible, they would fire. One shot, one confirmed destruction. Repeatedly, Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron witnessed this harrowing spectacle unfold daily. He observed tanks approach a hedgerow, incline as they attempted to ascend, and subsequently erupt in flames. The crews seldom survived. Those who did were left traumatized, physically burned, or both. Medical personnel were inundated. The mortuary detail operated overtime. The tactical predicament was dire. Allied strategists had anticipated being 30 miles inland by this juncture, advancing towards Paris. Instead, they were ensnared within a dense network of hedgerows, achieving mere hundreds of yards of progress per day. Every field presented a distinct engagement. Every hedgerow posed a novel obstacle. The Germans required no substantial reinforcements. They simply needed to maintain their positions behind these natural bulwarks and systematically eliminate American armor as it exposed itself. Cullen was not an engineer. He lacked any university education. Prior to the war, he had been a mechanic in New Jersey, tending to automobiles and trucks. However, he possessed an intuitive understanding of machinery. He grasped the principles of leverage and force. And as he observed yet another Sherman immolate after attempting to conquer a hedgerow, a profound realization dawned upon him. The fundamental issue resided not with the hedgerows themselves, but with the tank's approach. They were endeavoring to surmount them rather than penetrate them. If one could somehow carve a path through the hedgerow at ground level, to plow through it instead of scaling it, the tank would never expose its vulnerable underbelly. The Germans would be unable to target what remained unseen. But how does one breach 10 feet of compacted earth, stone, and roots? These hedgerows had endured centuries of meteorological conditions. They would not yield to anything less than immense force applied with absolute precision. Cullen commenced sketching conceptualizations in a notebook he perpetually carried. His comrades in arms considered him eccentric. "Cullen's at it again," they would jest. "He's going to win the war with his little drawings." Their remarks were tinged with affection, yet carried an underlying skepticism. Numerous intelligent individuals had contemplated the Hedgerow conundrum, yet none had devised a solution. What prompted a mere sergeant to believe he could succeed where others had faltered? Cullen disregarded the prevailing doubt. He had long ago recognized that people consistently underestimated mechanics. They presumed that because one engaged in manual labor, one's intellect was consequently limited. However, every proficient mechanic is, at heart, a problem solver. Each repair represents a puzzle to be deciphered. One learns to perceive the intricacies of operation, the interplay of forces, and the methods required to compel recalcitrant machinery to perform its intended function. The hedgerows were merely another form of obstinate machinery. They required persuasion, nothing more, and Cullen believed he had discovered the means. He simply required a damaged tank, a quantity of scrap metal, and the authorization of an officer sufficiently audacious to permit his attempt. Sergeant Cullen approached his commanding officer, Captain Samuel Morrison, with a proposal that sounded utterly preposterous. He desired to repurpose a damaged Sherman tank, one that had sustained damage but remained operational, and affix steel prongs to its forward section. These prongs, fabricated from captured German anti-tank fortifications known as Czech hedgehogs, scattered liberally across the Normandy beaches, would function as colossal blades. The tank would then ram into hedgerows at maximum velocity, the prongs embedding themselves and tearing through the earth and roots, thereby creating an accessible passage. Captain Morrison regarded Cullen with an expression suggesting he had lost his faculties. "Let me ensure I comprehend this, Sergeant. You intend to take a tank that has already been fired upon, weld scrap metal to it, and then deliberately propel it at full speed into a solid earthen embankment. That is your strategy?" "Yes, sir," Cullen replied with composure. "The current strategy involves driving tanks over hedgerows, where they are struck on their undersides. My strategy ensures the frontal armor consistently faces the enemy. The Germans cannot penetrate frontal armor. They require the underside strike. If we deny them that opportunity, they cannot destroy the tank." Morrison remained silent for a considerable duration. The logic was undeniably sound, yet it bordered on madness. Implementing modifications to tanks in a combat theater, employing untested equipment in the heat of battle. If it failed, valuable tanks and experienced crews would be lost. If it succeeded, we might actually begin to achieve progress. "How long do you estimate it will take to construct this device?" Morrison inquired. "Grant me 2 days, some welding apparatus, and permission to salvage metal from the beach obstacles. I shall present a prototype." Morrison made a decision that would profoundly impact the trajectory of the Normandy campaign. "You have 48 hours. If this endeavor proves unsuccessful, we will both be compelled to provide explanations to some exceedingly displeased generals." Cullen rendered a crisp salute and immediately commenced his task. He requisitioned an acetylene torch, welding equipment, and a work detail. Subsequently, he proceeded to the beaches where the initial D-Day landings had occurred. These beaches were now strewn with German defensive impediments, the very obstacles designed to thwart Allied landing craft, but which had been largely circumvented during the initial assault. The Jack hedgehogs were ideally suited for Cullen's objective. These were formidable steel anti-tank devices, comprising 3 heavy iron beams welded together in the configuration of a colossal jack, akin to an immense children's toy, but constructed from hardened steel and weighing hundreds of pounds. The Germans had strategically placed thousands of these structures on the beaches, believing they would halt tanks and landing craft. Instead, they had become inert scrap metal awaiting repurposing. Cullen and his crew meticulously dismantled the hedgehogs using torches. Working throughout the night, they trimmed the steel beams to the requisite length, approximately 4 feet. They sharpened the tips. They reinforced the welded joints. By the conclusion of the first day, they had 4 prongs prepared, each as substantial as a man's thigh and as robust as railroad track. The subsequent phase demanded greater precision.
They were tasked with welding these prongs to the front of a Sherman tank without compromising the tank's structural integrity or impeding its maneuverability. Cullen meticulously calculated angles and positions. The prongs needed to be situated low enough to engage the base of the hedgerow, spaced sufficiently wide to obliterate a substantial section, and robust enough to withstand the impact without fracturing. "Do you genuinely believe this will be effective?" inquired Private Eddie Kowalski, one of the welders assisting with the project.
"I am certain it will be effective," Cullen responded, adjusting his welding mask. "The principles of physics are sound. Steel teeth propelled by 30 tons of tank impacting earth and roots. Something must yield, and it will not be the steel." By dawn on the second day, the modification was complete. The Sherman tank now bore 4 steel prongs extending from its front, resembling the formidable tusks of some mechanical leviathan. Soldiers congregated to observe the peculiar construction. Some expressed admiration, while others remained unconvinced.
More than a few placed wagers on whether Cullen would face a court-martial or receive commendation. "It resembles a pig attempting to consort with a porcupine," quipped one soldier. Cullen affectionately patted a steel prong. "Perhaps so, but this pig is about to root its way through every hedgerow between here and Berlin." Captain Morrison surveyed the modified tank, scrutinizing the welds and testing the sturdiness of the prongs. Finally, he nodded. "Very well, Sergeant. You have engineered your audacious contraption. Now you must demonstrate its efficacy."
"Tomorrow morning, we shall locate a suitably formidable hedgerow and ascertain whether this invention represents genius or a suicidal endeavor." That night, Cullen found himself unable to sleep. He meticulously reviewed the calculations in his mind, time and again. The mathematics held true. The engineering was sound. However, a palpable chasm existed between theoretical principle and practical application. What if the prongs fractured upon impact? What if they penetrated too deeply, immobilizing the tank? What if the entire precarious assembly exacerbated the situation? Yet he recalled those burning Shermans, those crews who never escaped. He considered how the hedgerows were transforming Normandy into a veritable graveyard for American armor. A change was imperative, and if his concept proved successful, it possessed the potential to save countless lives. Tomorrow would provide the answer. The morning sun had scarcely crested the horizon when Cullen's modified Sherman advanced towards a particularly formidable hedgerow that had been designated for the test. It was a colossal barrier, 12 feet in height, ancient, and seemingly impenetrable. Several officers had assembled to witness the event, including Captain Morrison and Major Jack Williams from Division Headquarters. The Sherman's crew had voluntarily enlisted for the trial. Driver Corporal Jake Mitchell, gunner Sergeant Tom Harrison, and loader Private First Class Danny Chen. They were either remarkably brave or profoundly reckless, perhaps a combination of both. As they sealed the hatches and the engine thrummed to life, the assembled soldiers fell into a profound silence. Cullen stood with the observers, his heart pounding with apprehension. Everything he had calculated, everything he had constructed, hinged upon the ensuing 60 seconds. If it succeeded, they would revolutionize the Normandy campaign. If it failed catastrophically, brave men might perish, and he would be the architect of their demise. "Ready?" Morrison inquired, looking towards Cullen. "As I shall ever be, sir." Morrison raised his arm, then lowered it, signaling the commencement of the operation. The Sherman's engine roared with increased intensity. Black smoke billowed from its exhaust. Then, with accelerating velocity, it charged directly at the hedgerow. 30 tons of steel hurtling towards an immovable object. The impact was thunderous. The entire tank vibrated violently. Earth erupted outwards. Roots snapped with sounds akin to rifle fire. For a fleeting moment, the tank appeared to stall, embedded within the dense mass of the hedgerow. Soldiers held their breath. Then, gradually at first,
The Sherman began to advance. The steel prongs were functioning. They were digging deep into the ancient earthwork, generating leverage, tearing through roots and stone. The tank tilted forward slightly, its underbelly remaining concealed, maintaining a nose-down attitude that kept its frontal armor presented to any potential adversary. More roots snapped. Dirt cascaded down the tank's hull. The engine screamed with exertion. And then, with a sudden surge, the Sherman burst through the opposite side of the hedgerow, emerging into the field beyond. The tank had carved a perfect breach, sufficiently wide to allow other vehicles to pass, and low enough that the tank's vulnerable underside had never been exposed. The soldiers erupted in jubilant cheers. Cullen felt his knees weaken with overwhelming relief. It had worked. His audacious concept had, against all odds, proven effective. The Sherman's crew unsealed their hatches and emerged, faces beaming. "That was the smoothest hedgerow crossing I have ever experienced," Corporal Mitchell exclaimed. "We barely registered the impact inside, and our underbelly was never once exposed to enemy fire." Major Williams approached Cullen, his expression grave. "Sergeant, what is the production capacity for these modifications? And what is the projected timeline?" "Sir, if I am provided with sufficient welders and access to additional hedgehog obstacles, my crew could modify 10 tanks per day, potentially more if we exert maximum effort." "Not sufficient," Williams stated, and Cullen's heart sank. Then the major offered a smile. "I shall procure 50 welders for you and all the steel required. I want 100 tanks modified by week's end. Furthermore, I am dispatching a report to General Bradley immediately." "This invention is poised to revolutionize our operations." Captain Morrison clapped Cullen heartily on the back. "Congratulations, Sergeant! You are no longer the mad mechanic. You are the brilliant mechanic who has just secured the Normandy campaign." However, Cullen was not yet inclined to celebrate. "Sir, with all due respect, a single successful trial does not guarantee efficacy in combat. We must test this against an actual German emplacement under genuine enemy fire. That is the sole method of verifying its true effectiveness." Morrison nodded grimly. "I anticipated such a response. There is a German strongpoint approximately 2 miles from here. They have effectively halted our advance for 3 days. The battalion's objective is to neutralize it, but every access route is impeded by hedgerows, and every attempt to traverse these barriers has proven suicidal. If your modification performs successfully there, under direct fire, it will unequivocally validate your concept." "When shall we proceed, sir?" "Tomorrow at dawn. I am assigning you to the tank as technical advisor. You will ride with Mitchell's crew. Should any complications arise, you must be present to observe and comprehend their nature." Cullen swallowed hard. He had hoped to remain behind and focus solely on constructing additional modifications. However, Morrison was correct. He needed to witness his invention in the crucible of actual combat. Only then would he ascertain whether the design required refinement. Only then could he truthfully declare it ready for mass production. "Understood, sir. I shall be prepared." That night, Cullen meticulously re-examined every weld on the modified Sherman. He tightened bolts. He inspected the prongs for any stress fractures resulting from the test. Everything appeared robust, but combat presented variables far beyond a controlled exercise. In battle, unforeseen circumstances invariably intervened. Private Chen found him laboring late under the solitary illumination of a lantern. "Sergeant, you should endeavor to rest. Tomorrow promises to be a significant day." "I cannot sleep, Chen. Too much contemplation." "Are you apprehensive?" Cullen considered offering a falsehood, then decided candor was the more prudent course. "Terrified. This device functions in theory. It performed adequately in a single test, but tomorrow the lives of men will depend on whether I correctly executed the calculations. If I overlooked something, if there exists a design flaw I fail to perceive, then—" "We trust you have observed everything," Chen stated simply. You constructed this contraption. You understand it more intimately than anyone. And tomorrow we shall obliterate those hedgerows and demonstrate to the Germans that they can no longer conceal themselves. Cullen wished he possessed Chen's unshakable conviction, but all he could do was prepare to the best of his ability and hope that his outlandish notion was, in fact, sheer genius. Tomorrow would be the ultimate trial. Dawn broke over Normandy, accompanied by a chilling drizzle that cast a pervasive grayness over the landscape. Cullen climbed into the Sherman tank, assuming his position in the commander's cupola, from which vantage point he could observe and provide technical guidance to the crew. His stomach churned with nervous energy. The strategy was straightforward. Their tank, now christened Rhinoceros by the crew, would spearhead a modest contingent towards the German strongpoint. They would employ the hedgerow cutter to breach the impediments that had thus far rendered all advances futile. Infantry would follow closely behind, utilizing the breaches to progress without succumbing to the deadly kill zones established by the Germans. Mount up, the command resounded. Engines rumbled to life across the assembly area. The Rhinoceros shuddered and commenced its forward motion, its steel prongs gleaming slickly in the nascent dawn light. They approached the initial hedgerow. Beyond it, according to intelligence reports, lay a German machine gun emplacement that had been inflicting heavy casualties on American infantry for days. The conventional tactic would involve attempting to ascend the hedgerow, thereby exposing the tank's underbelly to a German Panzerfaust, a handheld anti-tank weapon capable of penetrating weak armor with alarming ease. Steady, Cullen instructed over the intercom. Engage it at a slight angle, approximately 20 degrees. That will assist the prongs in gaining purchase. Roger that, Corporal Mitchell replied, adjusting their trajectory. The impact was met with a bone-jarring crash. Earth and roots exploded outwards. Within the confines of the tank, the crew was jolted forward against their restraints, but nothing fractured. The prongs held firm. The tank pushed onward, its engines screaming, its tracks churning, tearing through vegetation that had thrived for centuries. And then they were through, emerging on the opposite side to confront a startled German machine gun crew frantically attempting to ready their weapon. The Sherman's main gun discharged first. A single high-explosive round effectively neutralized the threat before the Germans could effectively react. "It works!" Chen shouted over the intercom. "It is genuinely effective in combat." However, there was no respite for celebration. Additional hedgerows lay ahead, and behind each one, enemy combatants might be lurking. The Rhinoceros continued its relentless advance, breaching hedgerow after hedgerow. Each time, the prongs performed flawlessly. Each time, the tank emerged before the Germans could deploy their anti-tank armaments. The infantry following in the Rhinoceros's wake were exultant. For the first time since D-Day, they could advance without being pinned down by entrenched hedgerow defenses. They poured through the breaches meticulously created by the tank, dismantling German positions that had appeared utterly impregnable mere hours prior. Then came the ultimate test. Intelligence had forewarned them of a German Panther tank, a considerably more formidable adversary than infantry positioned behind a particularly massive hedgerow. The Panther's 75mm cannon possessed the capability to obliterate a Sherman at considerable range. Should the Rhinoceros become ensnared while breaching the hedgerow, it would become a stationary target. "Contact front," Harrison called out. Panther partially obscured behind the hedgerow. Cullen's mind raced. They could retreat, request artillery support, opt for a conservative approach, but that represented adherence to outdated doctrines. The very essence of his invention was to redefine the parameters of engagement. "Breach the hedgerow," Cullen commanded. "Do not falter for any reason. We proceed at maximum velocity. We emerge with our armament already trained upon that Panther's position. Speed is our paramount advantage." Mitchell did not hesitate. The Sherman surged forward. The impact was colossal. This particular hedgerow was denser than any they had previously encountered. For a terrifying moment, the tank's momentum seemed to wane, the prongs struggling against the formidable mass. "More power," Cullen shouted. "Give it everything you've got." The engine howled in response. Smoke billowed from the exhausts. The tracks churned up immense clouds of earth, and inch by agonizing inch, the rhinoceros forced its way through. They burst through the hedgerow at an angle. It was not a perfect breach, but it was adequate. Harrison had maintained his gun's aim on the projected location of the Panther, and as they emerged, there it was, its turret swiveling to track their unexpected appearance. Harrison fired first. The armor-piercing round struck the Panther's side armor, which was thinner than its frontal protection, and penetrated. The German tank shuddered violently, smoke emanating from its hatches. Its crew bailed out, and the rhinoceros's machine guns persuaded them to surrender rather than engage further. The advancing infantry caught up, securing the captured German soldiers. An officer approached the rhinoceros, a broad grin spreading across his face. "Sergeant Cullen, I cannot fathom what arcane sorcery you have employed on this tank, but you have accomplished in 2 hours what we have struggled to achieve for 3 days. That German strongpoint is effectively neutralized." Cullen disembarked from the tank, his legs trembling uncontrollably. He had succeeded. The design had proven its mettle not merely in a controlled trial, but in actual combat against genuine enemy positions under enemy fire. His audacious concept had vindicated itself. Captain Morrison arrived shortly thereafter, his radio crackling with incoming reports from other units. "Sergeant, I have just received word from Division. General Bradley himself desires an audience with you. Apparently, Major Williams's report has created a considerable impression. They are dubbing your invention the Cullen Hedgerow Cutter, and they mandate the immediate manufacture of 5,000 units. 5,000! Cullen could scarcely comprehend the magnitude of the figure. His humble alteration, fabricated in 48 hours from discarded metal, was destined for widespread adoption, deployed throughout the entirety of the Allied armored force. "Sir, I am merely a mechanic," Sergeant Cullen stated, interrupting. "I am uncertain I should be credited. You are the individual who resolved the hedgerow obstacle." Captain Morrison replied, "Own it, Sergeant. You have fundamentally reshaped the conflict." The Sherman tank's engine thundered with renewed intensity. Dark exhaust billowed from its exhaust ports within days of the rhinoceros variant's successful engagement. Every tank repair facility across Normandy received directives to commence the installation of Cullen's hedgerow cutters. The military mobilized welding specialists from engineering units. They gathered additional check hedgerow obstacles from the beaches. Assembly lines were established in open fields, operating continuously. Cullen found himself detached from his regular unit and assigned the crucial task of instructing welding teams. He traveled from one facility to another, demonstrating the precise angles for the prongs, the correct welding procedures, and the reinforcement techniques necessary to prevent the cutters from fracturing under extreme force. The critical element, he emphasized to each newly trained group of welders, was the low positioning of the prongs. If set too high, the tank would pitch forward, exposing its vulnerable underbelly. If placed too low, they would merely churn soil without severing roots. "You need them positioned precisely here," he would explain, marking the spot with chalk at a 15-degree downward angle. This configuration ensures optimal cutting action. Initially, some welders harbored doubts. The contraption appeared rudimentary, essentially steel spikes attached to a tank. However, upon viewing combat footage of the rhinoceros tanks effortlessly traversing hedgerows that had previously halted all advances, skepticism transformed into fervent enthusiasm. Their pace quickened, and they took immense pride in the enhancements they were implementing. General Omar Bradley personally visited one of the tank modification sites. He discovered Cullen deeply engrossed in a welding task, instructing a fresh crew. "Sergeant Cullen, I presume?" General Bradley addressed him. Cullen snapped to attention, recognizing the insignia on Bradley's collar. "Yes, sir." "At ease, Sergeant," Bradley commanded. "I have come to meet the man who extricated my army," Bradley offered a smile. "Your innovation is remarkable in its simplicity." We had been deploying complex engineering solutions to the Hedgerow challenge for weeks: artillery barges, explosive demolition charges, modified bulldozers. None proved consistently effective. And then you arrive with scrap metal and a welding torch and solve it in 2 days? "Sir, I simply did what was necessary," Cullen responded. "That is the hallmark of a good soldier," Bradley concluded. "I am recommending you for the Legion of Merit and authorizing your field promotion to technical sergeant."
This army requires more individuals capable of unconventional thinking. Following Bradley's departure, Cullen's fellow crew members swarmed him with congratulations. Yet, Cullen felt a profound sense of unease. He was being lauded as a visionary, receiving accolades and advancements. Meanwhile, men continued to perish in Normandy. His creation was proving beneficial, but it was not a panacea. The war was far from concluded. Private Kowalski, who had assisted with the initial prototype, drew him aside. "Are you all right, Sarge?" Kowalski inquired.
"You don't seem particularly thrilled by all this." "I am, Eddie," Cullen replied. "I just can't stop thinking about all the crews we lost before this invention. What if I had conceived of it sooner? What if I had pressed harder for its testing?" "You cannot dwell on that," Kowalski stated firmly. "You cannot rescue those who have already fallen, but you are saving the lives of those who remain. Every day, more tanks equipped with your cutters are breaching hedgerows. Every day, fewer crews are perishing in flames."
That is what truly matters. Cullen recognized the truth in Kowalski's words, yet the burden of guilt persisted. In moments of quiet reflection, his thoughts would drift to the tank crews who had perished attempting to surmount hedgerows in the initial weeks following D-Day. If only he had acted with greater haste. If only he had been more insistent. If only. But war offered no indulgence for such contemplations. It demanded constant forward momentum, persistent problem solving, and an unwavering effort to preserve as many lives as possible. As the Cullen hedgerow cutters gained widespread implementation, soldiers in the field began submitting reports detailing their own suggestions and modifications. While the cutters performed admirably, there was always scope for enhancement. Some crews discovered that adding a fifth central prong improved their efficacy against particularly dense hedgerows. Others experimented with serrated edges on the prongs, which aided in gripping and tearing through stubborn root systems. A few resourceful tank commanders incorporated reinforcing plates to safeguard the welds from enemy small arms fire. Cullen wholeheartedly embraced these adaptations. He had never claimed his design to be flawless, merely functional. If soldiers in the field could elevate its performance, he was eager to learn from their insights. The most valuable ideas emerge from those actively utilizing the equipment, he explained to a visiting war correspondent. "I conceived the fundamental concept, but dozens of tank crews have contributed to its refinement. This is no longer solely my invention. It belongs to every soldier who has made it superior." One particularly ingenious modification originated from a tank crew in the 3rd Armored Division. They observed that the cutters occasionally became obstructed by compacted earth and roots, diminishing their effectiveness on subsequent hedgerows. They devised a simple mechanism inspired by agricultural harrow implements that automatically cleared debris from the prongs as the tank advanced. It was a minor alteration, yet it enabled tanks to penetrate multiple hedgerows consecutively without requiring manual clearing of the cutters. Cullen promptly integrated this improvement into his instructional protocols for new installations. "You see, that's true ingenuity," he would remark to welding crews. "I never considered the issue of debris clearance. Some tanker in the field identified the problem and devised a solution." That is how effective engineering evolves, through iterative refinement and input from those actively engaged with the product. The German response to the hedgerow cutters proved noteworthy. Initially, they appeared perplexed by the sudden Allied capacity to breach hedgerows.
Post-war German after-action reports captured later in the conflict conveyed bewilderment. Enemy armor is now traversing hedgerows without exposing vulnerable sectors. The method employed is unknown. Once they discerned the operational principle, the Germans implemented various countermeasures. They attempted to bolster hedgerows with concealed mines. They positioned anti-tank guns at angles designed to intercept breaching tanks. They even devised deceptive hedgerows as traps, with pre-stationed anti-tank weaponry awaiting advancing tanks. However, none of these countermeasures yielded consistent success. The fundamental predicament remained. Cullen's cutter empowered tanks to breach hedgerows while maintaining their formidable frontal armor facing the adversary. As long as Allied tank crews adhered to sound tactical principles, the Germans could not effectively counteract this newfound capability. By August of 1944, as Allied forces liberated Normandy and embarked on their rapid advance across France, the hedgerow cutters had become standard equipment. Newly manufactured Sherman tanks emerging from production lines in the United States were equipped with pre-welded attachment points for the cutters. The battlefield modification had officially transitioned into an integral aspect of tank design. Cullen had, in essence, revolutionized tank manufacturing. As Allied forces pushed beyond Normandy into the more open expanse of inland France, the hedgerow cutters saw diminished use for their original intended purpose. However, tank crews swiftly discovered unforeseen secondary applications for the cutters. In urban combat, the steel prongs proved exceptionally effective for smashing through brick walls and wooden barricades. Tank crews utilized them to breach buildings occupied by German snipers. The psychological impact was devastating. The sheer sound of a 30-ton tank demolishing a wall was often sufficient to compel German defenders to surrender rather than engage in futile resistance. During river crossings, crews found that the cutters provided enhanced traction when tanks were required to ascend muddy riverbanks. The prongs dug into the slippery terrain, preventing tanks from sliding backward during critical maneuvers. In winter combat conditions, the cutters assisted in pushing through snowdrifts that would have otherwise immobilized vehicles. They functioned akin to colossal snowplows, clearing pathways for advancing troops and vehicles. Cullen, now a master sergeant attached to an engineering evaluation team, journeyed to various units to study these inventive applications. He meticulously recorded observations, sketched modifications, and proposed design enhancements based on his field assessments. "I never envisioned my hedgerow cutters being utilized for such purposes," he wrote in a letter home. "My sole objective was to penetrate the Norman hedgerows, but soldiers possess remarkable creativity. They adapt any tool to serve their needs. My cutters have evolved into versatile battlefield instruments." The most unanticipated application emerged during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944. German forces, launching their final significant offensive, had erected extensive roadblocks using felled trees to impede Allied counterattacks. Tank crews discovered that hedgerow cutters could displace or shatter these arboreal obstacles, enabling armored columns to maintain their forward momentum even when roadways were obstructed. One after-action report detailed a Sherman crew employing their cutters to literally push a disabled German tank from a narrow roadway, thereby clearing the path for an entire American contingent to advance. The report stated, "The cutter prongs engaged beneath the German tank's skirt armor, and with considerable exertion, our Sherman succeeded in maneuvering the obstruction aside." This unconventional utilization of the hedgerow cutter prevented a delay of several hours, which could have jeopardized their strategic objectives. Cullen found this anecdote particularly amusing. "I fashioned a device to cut through foliage," he would recount, "and now they are employing it to reposition immobilized enemy armor. Warfare certainly fosters ingenuity, I suppose." However, not all developments were positive. Certain tanks experienced equipment malfunctions when the cutters were employed beyond their designed operational limits. The prongs fractured when tanks attempted to force their way through reinforced concrete barriers. Welds failed when crews attempted to utilize the cutters for lifting heavy objects. There were even instances of friendly fire incidents where other units operating in conditions of poor visibility failed to recognize modified tanks and mistook the silhouette of the prongs for enemy hardware. Cullen collaborated with Army engineers to develop more effective training materials. The cutter is a tool, not a magical artifact, he emphasized during training sessions. It possesses limitations. Misuse it and you risk damaging it or causing casualties. Employ it correctly and it will preserve your life and ensure mission accomplishment. By early 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany itself, the Hedgerow cutter had become such a standard piece of equipment that new tankers could barely recall a time when Shermans were not so equipped. The innovation had become normalized, seamlessly integrated into military doctrine and tactical employment. For Cullen, this was a source of both immense satisfaction and a touch of melancholy. His creation had achieved success beyond his wildest imaginings. Yet, this success meant that people had forgotten it had ever represented a significant challenge. The hedgerow cutters were simply present, an intrinsic component of the tank, unremarkable. That is the true measure of effectiveness, Captain Morrison told him, when people cannot even conceive of a different reality. You did not merely solve a problem, Cullen, you eradicated it so completely that its very existence has faded from memory. Not every aspect of the hedgerow cutter's success story was unequivocally positive. There were inherent costs and ramifications that Cullen had not fully foreseen. The primary cost was human. As tanks acquired the capacity to breach hedgerows with rapid efficiency, infantry commanders began employing armor with increased aggression. Certain assaults that might have been postponed or canceled in the pre-cutter era were now initiated with the expectation that tanks could overcome hedgerow impediments. This resulted in some units being deployed into situations where they incurred casualties that greater prudence might have averted. Cullen grappled with this guilt. Did I provide commanders with a tool that fostered overconfidence? He mused aloud to Chaplain Thomas O'Brien during a rare moment of introspection. You provided them with a tool that saved lives, O'Brien responded gently. The tactical choices made by commanders utilizing that tool are their responsibility, not yours. You cannot dictate how individuals employ your creations. Your role is to endeavor to produce instruments that yield more benefit than detriment. There was also the matter of the German defenders. The hedgerow cutters had undeniably accelerated the Normandy campaign, thereby saving Allied lives. However, it also meant that German soldiers who might have survived a more protracted, cautious Allied advance were instead killed during the swifter push facilitated by the cutters. Cullen understood this intellectually. It was the grim reality of war, the objective being the defeat of the enemy. Yet emotionally, it was more difficult to process. I caused the deaths of people I never encountered, he confided to Kowalski one evening. Not directly, but my invention placed tanks in positions where they could inflict greater casualties. I am being honored for that. Medals for making killing more efficient? It feels profoundly wrong. Kowalski was silent for a moment. You know what feels wrong to me? He countered. Watching good men burn inside tanks because we couldn't breach hedgerows without exposing ourselves. You prevented that. Yes, your invention killed Germans. It's a weapon modification, after all. That is its purpose. But it also saved Americans. More importantly, it shortened the war. Every day this war continues, lives are lost, Americans, Germans, French civilians caught in the crossfire. Your creation helped bring it to a swifter conclusion. That saves lives across the board, even if it doesn't feel that way. Cullen desired to believe this. He needed to believe it. However, the moral complexities of warfare were never simple. Furthermore, there was a logistical cost that no one had anticipated: strain on the supply chain. The rapid Allied advance, enabled by the hedgerow cutters, meant that logistics could not always keep pace. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts had to be expedited to units suddenly positioned miles beyond planners' projections. Some units experienced supply shortages, forcing them to halt their advance and creating tactical vulnerabilities. Cullen found himself participating in meetings with logistics officers, attempting to articulate that the success of his invention had generated challenges they needed to address. "I provided you with a tool that enhances tank effectiveness," he would explain. "Now, you must devise methods to sustain those tanks as they advance at a pace exceeding all prior expectations." It was an unusual position for an enlisted sergeant to offer strategic advice to officers, yet his unique perspective as the inventor commanded attention. The Army adapted, developing new logistical procedures and supply methodologies to accommodate the accelerated operational tempo facilitated by the hedgerow cutters. Perhaps the most peculiar cost was psychological. Cullen became renowned within the Army, hailed as the ingenious mechanic who had conquered an insurmountable challenge. Soldiers sought his autograph, officers requested his presence at briefings, and war correspondents clamored for interviews. He detested the attention. "I am not comfortable with this," he confessed to Morrison. "I am simply an individual who had an idea. I did not storm a beach or charge a machine gun nest. I merely welded some metal onto a tank. Why am I being treated as a hero when genuine heroes are falling daily?" Morrison understood. "Your discomfort stems from your humility, which is commendable. However, consider this. Those soldiers charging machine gun nests are heroes due to their courage. You are a hero because of your intellect. Both forms of heroism are essential to winning wars. Accept it, Sergeant. You have earned it." Reluctantly, Cullen learned to accept the recognition, though he never felt entirely at ease with it. In his mind, he remained merely a mechanic from New Jersey who had devised a method for cutting through bushes. Germany surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945. The war in Europe had concluded. Cullen stood with his unit in a small German town, observing the soldiers' jubilant celebrations. There was an admixture of joy, relief, and exhaustion, emotions too complex to easily categorize. The hedgerow cutters had played a significant role in the victory. By most estimations, they had shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks, possibly months. This acceleration had cascading consequences: a swifter advance across France, the earlier liberation of Paris, a hastened crossing of the Rhine, and a prompt arrival in Berlin. Each day saved translated into lives preserved, resources conserved, and suffering alleviated. Official citations credited the Cullen hedgerow cutter with making a substantial contribution to the successful conclusion of the Normandy campaign and subsequent operations. In the European theater, General Eisenhower himself had lauded it as one of the war's most impactful tactical innovations. Cullen received the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and a commendation from the Supreme Allied Commander. He was promoted to warrant officer. His name appeared in newspapers back home. He became an emblem of American ingenuity, the common soldier who employed practical sense and scrap metal to solve a problem that had baffled experts. Yet as he stood in that German town, watching the festivities unfold, Cullen felt a sense of emptiness. The problem he had solved was no longer relevant. The war was over. The hedgerows of Normandy were a distant memory from a year prior. His invention, though revolutionary, was now merely a footnote in the chronicle of a conflict that had claimed tens of millions of lives. "You are overthinking again," Kowalski remarked, appearing beside him with 2 bottles of liberated German beer. "Just reflecting," Cullen replied, accepting a bottle. "A year ago, I was welding prongs onto a tank, hoping my idea would work. Now the war is over, and I'm trying to comprehend its significance." "It meant you saved lives," Kowalski stated simply. "My life, quite possibly. I was in the infantry before being transferred to your welding crew. Had I remained in the infantry, had tanks been unable to breach hedgerows, I would likely be deceased." The same applies to hundreds of other fellows. Your invention mattered, Sarge. Never doubt that. They drank in silence, observing the sunset over a ravaged Germany. Cullen contemplated the myriad choices that had converged to bring him to this juncture. Had he dismissed his initial concept as too rudimentary? Had Morrison denied permission? Had the initial test proved unsuccessful? Had the combat trial gone awry? Any one of those moments could have irrevocably altered the outcome. "Do you know what's peculiar?" Cullen eventually said. "I keep thinking about the German tankers. They were positioned behind hedgerows, confident in their security. Then, suddenly, American tanks were breaching barriers that were supposed to be impenetrable. What must that have felt like, to have the rules of warfare fundamentally shift overnight?" "Probably felt like losing," Kowalski replied, "which is what they deserved for initiating this whole debacle," Cullen nodded. But the thought lingered. The war was replete with innovations, each side relentlessly seeking an advantage, aiming to surprise the enemy, to redefine the rules. His hedgerow cutter was but one illustration. Countless others existed: radar, proximity fuses, enhanced armor, refined tactics. Each innovation rendered an opponent's defensive position obsolete, their meticulous preparations futile. Such was the nature of warfare, but also, arguably, the nature of progress. When one surmounted a challenge in conflict, it was not solely about defeating the adversary. It was about demonstrating that problems could be resolved, that human ingenuity could conquer seemingly insurmountable obstacles. "I wonder what will become of all those cutters now," Cullen mused. "Thousands of tanks with my prongs welded on. What do you do with them when there are no more hedgerows to cut through?" "Scrap them, most likely," Kowalski replied, "or leave them on as mementos. Either way, they served their purpose. That's all any tool can aspire to." Curtis Cullen returned to his home in New Jersey in late 1945, bearing decorations and memories, yet eager to leave the war behind. He resumed his former occupation, repairing automobiles and trucks in a modest garage. The skills that had fostered his wartime innovation served him well in peacetime. He possessed a natural aptitude for machinery, excelled at problem solving, and had an uncanny ability to perceive solutions overlooked by others. However, he seldom spoke of the hedgerow cutter. When acquaintances or companions inquired about his wartime exploits, he would skillfully sidestep the topic. "I was merely a mechanic, tending to tanks, nothing remarkable," he'd say, omitting any mention of the commendations, the groundbreaking advancements, or the fact that his own creation had fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Normandy offensive. His wife, Margaret, once probed his reticence to recount his wartime accomplishments. "You are a true hero," she'd stated. "You ought to feel a sense of pride." "I am proud of my contributions," Cullen responded with quiet sincerity. "However, I am not proud of the purpose they served. I engineered a device that facilitated the act of killing. It did preserve American lives, which is significant, but its ultimate function was rooted in conflict. I find more fulfillment in repairing things now rather than dwelling on how I aided in destruction then." Over the ensuing decades, military historians gradually acknowledged the profound importance of the Cullen hedgerow cutter. Its significance was documented in texts concerning the Normandy campaign, featured in films about wartime innovations, and incorporated into military instructional materials as a prime illustration of ingenuity born of necessity in the field. Yet Ken himself remained largely an obscure figure, recognized primarily within academic circles focused on military history. In the year 1984, 40 years following the D-Day landings, a promising young scholar named David Carter sought out Cullen, then 73 years of age and long retired. Carter was in the process of authoring a book on tactical advancements during the Second World War and was keen to interview the originator of the hedgerow cutter. "Mr. Cullen, do you grasp the magnitude of your invention's impact?" Carter inquired during their discussion. "Military experts estimate that it accelerated the Normandy campaign by several weeks. It is credited with saving thousands of lives and fundamentally reshaping armored warfare doctrine. And all of this originated from you, a humble sergeant possessing no formal engineering qualifications, accomplishing it within a mere 48 hours. Cullen remained silent for a considerable duration. Then he articulated a sentiment that Carter would later immortalize in his book as the quintessential embodiment of American inventiveness. I wasn't exceptional. I was simply an individual who understood mechanical principles and identified a challenge requiring resolution. The exceptional aspect was the Army's willingness to grant me the opportunity to attempt a solution. How many other worthwhile concepts were dismissed simply because they emerged from an unexpected source? How many problems persisted unsolved because someone declared, "That's not our established procedure"? He paused. I was fortunate. My unconventional idea was given a chance. But I assure you, there were 100 other fellows with equally brilliant notions that no one deigned to consider. But your idea succeeded, Carter persisted. That fact alone makes you exceptional. My idea succeeded because people were open to it, Cullen corrected. Captain Morrison could have easily said no. The testing unit could have refused participation. The division could have rejected it following the initial combat evaluation. But they chose not to. They evaluated the concept, not the individual proposing it. That, in my view, is the genuine takeaway. Not that I possessed some extraordinary intellect, but rather that valuable ideas can originate from any quarter, provided one is receptive to listening. Curtis Cullen passed away in 1963. His obituary in the local newspaper described him as a mechanic, a veteran, and a man of quiet disposition who preferred mending things to discussing them. The hedgerow cutter was conspicuously absent from its mention. The majority of his neighbors remained unaware that the unassuming gentleman who repaired their automobiles had played a role in altering the course of the Second World War. However, within military institutions across both America and Europe, specimens of the Cullen hedgerow cutter are carefully preserved. These are sections of steel affixed to the forward section of Sherman tanks. Their appearance is deceptively simple and rudimentary, yet their effectiveness was nothing short of revolutionary. Accompanying placards elucidate their function and significance. And on occasion, they bear the name Curtis Cullen, the unconventional mechanic who refused to concede that certain problems were insurmountable.